unsullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
Good morning. As we approach the subject matter this morning, as we look closer at the end of the aging process and the decisions that both legal, moral, and courageous that face us as we come to the end of the dialogue and the process we call aging. We come to some of the toughest questions, and to help us understand those this morning, we have two captains courageous that we will be introducing to you. As I said this morning, good morning, I am reminded of the times, many times, unfortunately, that I, as a lawyer, have had to represent people who are in comas, when surrounded by people who are beginning to come into that place where they have to make decisions about those people. Is this life worth living, et cetera, et cetera. And good morning whenever I'm in these situations, because it was a pastor, a missionary pastor, who taught me that whenever you get towards death and dying decisions, you need to constantly, minute by minute, be saying to yourself, good morning. I learned this as he sat with his daughter, who had been in one of the most horrendous traffic accidents I have ever seen. Pried from the jaws of death, his daughter lay in a coma for almost a year. And we sat there, and he would sit there and visit with her and then visit with everyone in the ICU for a year. He put the Bible on tapes on his daughter's ears, and he never gave up hope. And whether it was morning or evening or afternoon, whether we were down in the lunchroom or talking to the nurses at the station, he would always say, to introduce himself, good morning. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer, and I said, Bill, there's nothing really good, and we're not even in the morning. It's evening now. You're driving me crazy. Why do you do that? And he said, because his mercies are new every morning. And I've never forgotten it. Another person that probably you will not forget after you hear him is the person I have the honor to introduce, Wesley Smith. Wes was born and raised in Los Angeles, and where he practiced law from 1976 to 1985, during which time he was a partner in his own law firm and served on several Bar Association committees, including the State Bar Committee on Public Affairs. Wes left the full-time practice of law to pursue a career in writing and public advocacy, and in the process got even more law than he had left. He has authored and co-authored 8 books. His first book was the Lawyer Book. The rest of the books that Nuts and Bolts Guide to Client Survival. He then wrote a number of consumer protection books along with Ralph Nader. I first was introduced to Wesley when I read his book, Forced Exit, The Slippery Slope from Assisted to Legalized Murder, and then what I consider to be his tour de force, The Culture of Death, The Assault on Medical Ethics in America. Given my background recently working in the stem cells controversy, I needed somebody to explain the underlying philosophy that I was sort of getting in dribs and drabs in this press statement and in that debate. Nobody explained it better to me than Wesley Smith. And so, frankly, even though I would have come to this conference anywhere as a co-sponsor. I was thrilled to hear that Wesley was coming to talk to us because, in many ways, Wes has become a hero to me. By the way, if you'd like to purchase Wes' book or have him sign it, he'll be in the back after his talk today, and he'll be happy to sign one of his books, The Culture of Death, The Assault on Medical Ethics in America, a warning about the dangers of the modern bioethics movement. I could say a lot of other things about Wes, like the fact that he's been on about every media outlet more than once in this country. It says here that he's been on 800 television and radio talk programs. The fact that he has done that and still can sanely address you this morning is a testimony of his intellectual vigor and his desire to keep coming back for more. Finally, and in an audience like this, I can say this, Wes has told me recently that he, like myself, believe me, lawyers are not without hope, believe it can happen. We can come to Christ. The Lord can pursue us. The way the first member of the CLS, Christian Legal Society, came to Christ was St. Paul. As you know, what it took was to be knocked off his high horse, driven into the dust, and blinded for a season. Wesley describes his own conversion as the Joe Louis school of conversion. You can run, but you cannot hide. Would you please welcome our speaker this morning, Wesley Smith, as he talks to us about death and dying.
His face appears on post offices around the country. You know, it's really a great pleasure to come from California to Illinois, I have to say. How refreshing to go into a room, turn on the switch, and the lights come on. You know, people often say we in California don't enjoy seasons, and I say, sure we do. Earthquake, mudslide, brush fire, and rolling blackout. I want to honor all of you for taking your time and money and involvement to come all the way to Illinois from wherever you may be, to stand up for the equality and sanctity of all human life. You know, I have a real belief that leaders get way too much credit. The way things happen and the way life changes is because of supporters and people dedicated day in and day out to making life a better experience and this a better world. And that's you folk. So I want to honor you for coming here and for listening and for caring. I think that's very important. And I'm here because I think that this country, in fact the West, faces a profound moral crisis. A profound moral crisis. And what makes it so profound, and what makes it, at least for me, so personally frightening, is that most people out there don't know that it exists. Most people are not aware as to the actual direction in which our society appears to be heading. And that's because I think it's too painful to contemplate. How much easier to watch Survivor? How much easier to watch the Dodgers lose once again? How much easier to think of other things than focus on what is happening to humanity, what is happening to our belief in the equality of all human life, what is happening to the most weak and vulnerable among us. And I was very happy to meet Senator Brownback yesterday and hear him speak last night. And the stem cell issue is not isolated in a little vacuum. It's part of a big picture. And I think too often we tend to, I certainly learned this in law school, you take a class in contracts or you take a class in evidence. And as you're going through law school, everything's a little piece, separate in a vacuum by itself. But at some point, you've got to put them all together into an organic whole. And I think in our society, when we talk about things such as stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, or we talk about whether or not it is acceptable to dehydrate someone to death because they've got a cognitive disability, we miss that concept of the big picture. We tend to focus very carefully only on the parameters of each issue, and that way we don't have to connect dots. And I see my work, at least that's what I think is going on here, as being a dot connector. Paul Revere, if you will, is another metaphor I like to use. And just remember this, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not really after you. I think one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that we have to learn how to talk to the society that no longer accepts religious talk as an acceptable lexicon for the public square. Because a lot of people I know might go up to someone and say, you know, only God can take a life. And that person is likely to say, well, I don't believe in God, so what do I care what you think? Or you might go up to someone who would say, only God can take a life. And that person would say, I agree with you, but I don't want to impose my religious beliefs on other people. We live, whether people like it or not, in a secular country that now talks a secular lexicon. The good news is the message is as compelling on a secular basis as it is on a religious basis. And the fact that someone may wish to speak to you in secular talk should not cause you the least bit pause. For example, let's talk about the sanctity of life ethic. What are we talking about when we talk about sanctity of life? We are saying, and this is the core value of Western civilization, that each and every one of us has equal inherent moral worth. Now, there is a coin of the realm that does work, and that is equality. I don't care what issue you're talking about out there in the public square, equality lies at its root. And when we say each and every human being has equal inherent moral worth, the sanctity of life ethic, some prefer to call it the equality of life ethic, what are we saying? What are we saying? There's no such thing as them. There's only us. There's no such thing as them. There's only us. Now, why is that important? You don't kill us. You don't exploit us. You don't oppress us. You do those things to them. And the whole history of the human race has been finding a way to make a them so that we can't steal their land or kill them or exploit them, so forth and so on. And we are now doing that very same thing to the weakest and most vulnerable human life among us. We're doing it at the embryonic level. We're doing it when people are elderly. We're doing it when they are disabled, and so forth. And leading that charge is bioethics. Now, why is that important? Healthcare is, I suppose with the exception of being a clergyman, the most supposedly altruistic profession there is. Nursing, physicians. It is about giving to your patient. And I have to say, and sometimes I forget to say this, so I wish to say it now, the reason why, in my opinion, the United States and Western healthcare system remains essentially generally moral is the people working in the system, the people working in healthcare. The doctors who are out there fighting the utilitarian agenda, which I will be describing. The nurses out there fighting for the benefit of their patients who can't fight for themselves. But there is a tremendous pressure being placed on those good folk in the trenches of clinical medicine. Part of it comes from managed care, as you all know if you work in healthcare, the cutting of the staffing, the culture that says we have to save money. And the other part, in my view, comes from, I don't know what you'd call it, utilitarian bioethics. I call it just bioethics, because frankly, if you don't accept the general bioethics morality, if you don't accept the general premises of bioethics, you have to put a modifier in front of the term bioethics. I'm a Christian bioethicist. I'm a Catholic bioethicist. I'm a human rights bioethicist. If you're just a bioethicist, you will tend to accept certain premises that are inherently destructive to equality. And let us go over those. First and foremost, bioethics ideology, and again, of course, there are dissenters, so I'm speaking generally. But bioethics ideology rejects sanctity, equality of life. It explicitly says that value of human life, not even human life, value of life is based on quality. It's called the quality of life ethic. Quality of life ethic. and that those with a higher perceived quality of life have greater value somehow than those with a lower perceived quality of life. Bioethics rejects the Hippocratic Oath, sees it as archaic, sees it as inadequate to the complexities of modern medicine. And in fact, according to the research I did, only about 13% of doctors today take the Hippocratic Oath. 13%, if that. Now, generally, this is a pretty knowledgeable audience, but generally when I go to a lay audience and mention that, there's a stunned gasp from the audience. And there's a reason for that. Let me read you something Sherwin Nuland said in the New England Journal of Medicine. Most of you probably know Sherwin Nuland wrote the book How We Die, a New York Times bestseller. He's a very big bioethicist and medical professor at Yale University. And we in the anti-euthanasia movement often call the New England Journal of Medicine the new euthanasia journal of medicine because it has, until Dr. Angel left a little bit ago, maybe things are changing because I've been noticing they're not quite so aggressive on these issues as they were when she was there. But they've been really a driving force towards the quality of life ethic, towards euthanasia, and towards some of the agendas that I will address in a few minutes. Sherwin Nuland, when a study came out from the Netherlands that said, gee, you know what? The Dutch doctors who are killing their patients are having problems. Patients have side effects. Some of them don't die. Some of them go into coma. There's some terrible problems. And Sherwin Nuland says, oh my gosh, that means we should train doctors to kill better. How about, it's like, it's astonishing. It's like, hey, you're burning yourself with a cigarette. Oh, okay, give me a lighter. It's a refusal to understand and turn away from a bad course. But here's what he said in terms of the Hippocratic Oath, and I think it's important that it occurred in the New England Journal of Medicine by one of the most famous doctors in the United States and perhaps the world. Quote, many opponents of these practices, euthanasia, assisted suicide, point to the Hippocratic Oath and its prohibition on hastening death. But those who turn to the oath in an effort to shape or legitimize their ethical viewpoints must realize that the statement has been embraced over approximately the past 200 years far more as a symbol of professional cohesion than for its content. Now, I submit Dr. Nuland wants professional cohesion. He should join the Rotary Club. The Hippocratic Oath is not for the doctor, it's for the patient. It protects the patient. And that's why the audiences gasp when I say that the Hippocratic Oath isn't taken anymore. The new do no harm ethic is evaporating. The idea that a doctor owes the individual patient, each and every individual patient, optimal care as an individual is becoming passé. And people are alarmed by that. Why? I mean, look at what we allow doctors to do to us. They cut us, they poke us, they see us naked. We tell them our most intimate secrets, and in return they are to give us their total loyalty, fealty, and fiduciary relationship. But we are told by bioethics that that's archaic. In fact, doctors also are to have what is called a divided loyalty. Sure, they're supposed to have loyalty to the patient, but they also have to have loyalty to the HMO. They also have to have loyalty to the entire group that they're in charge of, so that they're going to have to pick and choose who they give optimal care to and who they don't. Now, when you consider the dangers that that presents to people who might be despised by the doctor or the general society, people who might be deemed to have a life not worth living, people who are, need I say, expensive and might cut into bonuses that HMOs give doctors for keeping costs low. Very, very dangerous. But it gets worse than that. Bioethics ideology and philosophy, generally speaking, again, does not believe that there's anything special per se about human life. We are to be viewed as merely organic, merely biological for purposes of public policy and medical ethics. And therefore, they have tried to come up with the criteria by which life, not just human life, but life is to be judged as to whether or not it has value. Now, this has, because I'm a lawyer and I've got 45 minutes and it takes me that long to clear my throat, I could go through AB 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'd break for lunch. But let's just say it breaks down into the concept of the philosophy of personhood. That is, who is a person and who is not a person. Now, most of us think that a human being is almost a synonym for person, that if you're a born human being at least, you are a person. Bioethics says no. Now, what is a person under law? It's someone who has equal rights. A corporation is deemed a person for that purpose. They have equal rights under the law. The organization does. And all human beings are supposed to be persons too, but bioethics says, oh, no, no, no. We can't do that because we have to come up with a logical reason why someone might have rights. So we are going to make a distinction between persons and non-persons. And let me show you how explicitly discriminatory that is, because if that ever gets accepted, and I submit it's halfway home already, the idea of universal human rights is gone. That means every day you wake up, you've got to have the criteria that will be accepted to be a person. And that means if you don't, you're no longer a person, and you no longer have equal rights and some other rights that are very important. I walk out, right now I'm a person because of my cognitive capacity, able to speak, whether one agrees or doesn't agree. I'm at least able to, I think things through and present issues. If I go out and there's a thunderstorm and I get hit by lightning and I become a cognitively disabled person, suddenly I'm different in bioethics ideology. And when you think about how frightening that is for each and every one in this room, because we all age, we all grow ill. Disabled folk call those of us who are not disabled tabs, temporarily able-bodied. Because someday we all face the place where we cannot give as much as we must receive in return. Now, in a sanctity of life ethic, idealized obviously, we have a perpetual love machine, perpetual motion of love. That is, when I am capable of assisting my fellow brothers and sisters, I do so to the best of my ability. I think the Pope calls it radical self-giving. I think what a wonderful concept. And when my time comes where I need that kind of care, I receive it. And I'm not called a burden. And I'm not called a non-person. I'm called a precious brother, a precious sister, flesh of flesh and blood of blood. But in bioethics, no. When I come to that point, as we will get to, assuming I'm able to speak quickly, I may have a duty to die and get out of the way because I'm just unwanted material. Let's talk a little bit about some of the specific things that some of these bioethicists are saying. And I think it's important for you all to understand this, because if you go out into the society that's watching Survivor or watching the baseball games and not wanting to grapple with these issues, which we can all understand because they are painful. How many of us have been up till 3 in the morning? I used to have dark hair. It's painful. And people don't, it's a natural thing. We don't want to see pain. And all of us, by the way, in this room are failing at some level to see the full picture. All of us are. The culture of death is like being a fish in water. It's what we breathe. It's our environment. It's what we deal with every day. And sometimes we're not even aware of it. It happens to all of us. John Harris, PhD, is the Sir David Alliance Professor of Bioethics and Research Director for the Center for Social Ethics and Policy at the University of Manchester, England. He's a very big bioethical pioneer. And here's what he says, and this is key. And if you read this to folks or tell folks this, I read this in my speeches. It's like footnoting my speeches because people don't tend to believe me if I just tell them. So you have to prove it because people can't believe this is actually happening. That's the biggest problem and the biggest hurdle you're going to face is people are going to say it can't happen. I've had people say this, warning, ABC, and they say, oh, it can't happen here. 6 months later, I say, see ABC, and they say, oh, it's already too late. That's just a way of abdicating a human responsibility to get involved and make a difference. Here's what John Harris says about healthcare ethics, and this is in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, December 1999, and most of you know that that's really key because the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal is probably one of the top 5 bioethical journals in the world, at least in terms of being influential and respected. Quote, "Many, if not most of the problems of healthcare ethics presuppose that we have a view about," listen to this, "what sorts of beings," that's how they talk, beings, organisms, etc., "what sorts of beings have something that we might think of as ultimate moral value?" Now, I think almost everybody, if not everybody in this room would say, yeah, human beings. Pretty simple, but bioethics doesn't like simplicity. We like complexity. We like gray. Of course, gray is the color of fog, as in walking off a cliff because you can't see it. Or if this sounds too apocalyptic, Dr. Harris goes on, then we certainly need to identify those sorts of individuals who have the highest moral value or importance. Think about that. We have to identify those individuals who have the highest moral value or importance. Now, if we were saying we have to identify the race that has the highest moral value, or we have to identify the gender which has the highest moral value, we would say, "Sir, you are a bigot," and we would be right. But he is now creating different criteria. It's the same prejudice, just different victims. And somehow it's respectable, because who we're going after at this point in time are people with impaired cognitive capacities or cognitive capacities that have not yet developed. And again, the difference is person versus non-person. Harris goes on to say, and this tells you where we get to the rubber meets the road, personhood provides a species-neutral way of grouping creatures that have lives that would be wrong to end by killing or by letting die. These may include animals, machines, extraterrestrials, gods, angels, and devils. Persons who want to live are wrong by being killed because they are thereby deprived of something they value. Notice the relativism. It's not wrong to kill a human because it's wrong to kill a human. No, it's only wrong if they're deprived of something they value. Non-persons or potential persons cannot be wronged in this way because death does not deprive them of anything they can value. If they cannot wish to live, they cannot have that wish frustrated by being killed. So what are we talking about? Let's be blunt. I'm so sick of euphemisms. I'm so sick of public policy that won't call granite, granite, that won't call a redwood tree a redwood tree. What they are saying is, we're going to tell you who we can kill and get a good night's sleep. That's it. That's the harsh truth that a lot of people don't want to face, but they have to see it, or they and we will all end up being in the Soylent Green pond. As I said, I think we're in a moral crisis when that kind of talk is deemed respectable, and not only respectable, but the way of tomorrow. It's not just Harris, it's Beecham. And before I get to that, who are the non-persons, human non-persons? It's pretty generally agreed, although the criteria is still being debated. Or is it the criteria are still being debated? Newborn infants are not persons. And it has nothing to do with disability. Why? Because they are not self-aware over time, as Peter Singer might say, or because, I think Harris says, because they cannot be held morally accountable for actions, and so forth and so on. People with Alzheimer's disease are non-persons. Therefore, in bioethics parlance, Ronald Reagan is no longer a person. People like Robert Wendland. How many of you have heard of Robert Wendland? Not too many. I wish I had time to tell you the story of Robert Wendland, one of the most despicable events of medical history as far as I'm concerned. Cognitively disabled man who died last week at the heart of a struggle between his mother and his wife to whether or not the feeding tube could be pulled. Robert could drive during the trial. It came out he could drive a wheelchair down a hospital corridor. He could write the letter R, but he could not communicate. He could not do, go out and climb rocks. He was paralyzed on his right side. His mother said he reached out and kissed her hand. He is a non-person in bioethics. People in coma are non-persons in bioethics. People of that sort, newborn infants, people with senility, and so forth. And what does that mean? Let's hear what Tom Beecham has to say. Tom Beecham, most of you probably know, is the co-author of the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, the textbook that college students get when they're going to study bioethics. And in the same Kennedy Institute of Ethics journal, December 1999, he says this, quote, "Because many humans lack properties of personhood or are less than full persons, they are thereby rendered equal or inferior in moral standing to some non-humans. If this conclusion is defensible, we will need to rethink our traditional view that these unlucky humans cannot be treated in the ways we treat similarly relevantly similar non-humans. For example, and here's the kicker, they might be aggressively used as human research subjects and sources of organs." This is one of the most prominent bioethicists in the world. He's not Jack Kevorkian off on a fringe. He is at Georgetown University. He's with the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. He co-authored the most prominent book on bioethics, textbook on bioethics there is, the book that came up with the 4 principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and distributive justice, which are really just outcome determinators. You decide what you want to do, and then you pick the principle you want, rather than really using those to decide what's the right thing to do, in my opinion, but I don't have time to get into that. So this is not fringe stuff. And what he's talking about, let's be honest again, no more euphemisms. We're talking about turning human life into a natural resource, exploitable, like a timber forest or a cattle herd. And that connects to the stem cell issue, doesn't it? We're talking about strip mining human life when it's at the embryonic stage for the parts that we hope can provide medical benefit. But it doesn't stop at embryonic life. We're also talking about doing the same thing to people in comas or people who are not persons. There is an active attempt out there to redefine death to include permanent unconsciousness. And it's not Jack Kevorkian again. It's the most prominent bioethicist in organ transplant medicine, and I could give you 30 minutes on it. But it's in the literature. There are books written about it. Arnold, Jungner, others, Veitch. That's the same thing. And once you can do it to an embryo, because we're not dealing with abortion, after all, there's no woman being forced to choose anything or not being allowed to choose. You're just looking at the value of human life. And we're saying if we go forward with this embryonic stem cell strip mining, that life is property, as Senator Brownback put it. But we're also now talking about, as Beecham said, people who are not persons being treated in the same way. Very frightening stuff. I suppose if a person diagnosed in a permanent coma woke up, we'd have to call it a resurrection. Now, where does this lead us? And the reason I'm getting into this philosophy is because bad philosophy leads to very bad public policy and medical ethics, which hurt very real people. And that's where I'm going. But let's just go just a little further in terms of the philosophy. Peter Singer, most of you know who he is. Peter Singer is an Australian moral philosopher. In his case, that's an oxymoron. He says that because newborn infants are not persons, that parents can decide to keep or kill them. He used to say they should have 28 days to make that decision. He has since said, well, you know, there's no moral difference between an infant 27 days old and an infant 29 days old, so what the heck, let's give them up to a year, depending on a case-by-case analysis. Oh, that's nice. And here's what Peter Singer says about the reasons for that. Quote, and this is about a hemophiliac infant in his book, Practical Ethics, which is taught to almost every philosophy student in every college in this country today. Quote, when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of happy life for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second. Therefore, if killing the hemophiliac infant has no adverse effect on others, what about the infant? It would, according to the total view, be right to kill him. Now, what was Peter Singer's reward for such disgusting, despicable advocacy? He was appointed to one of the most prestigious chairs in bioethics at Princeton University 2 years ago, where he now spews his poison from here and has become a darling of the mainstream press, who say that people like Wesley Smith take him out of context. How do you take that out of context? You know, he's compared the value of a newborn infant to that of a fish, who he also doesn't see as a person. However, he does think that animals such as elephants and dogs, pigs, he says almost all mammals may be persons. And we saw what Beecham said, that some human beings, because they have lower capacities, actually will have to be used in the same way we treat some non-humans. But Peter Singer, who's the starter of the animal liberation movement and believes that animals and people have equal inherent moral worth, would say, no, we should probably, in some cases, use disabled people instead of animals in experiments. And a lot of bioethicists, I don't have time to give you the quotes, are advocating that as well. One more quote from a bioethicist about this killing babies business, because it's just amazing, and this man is accepted as a major player in bioethics. Jonathan Glover. Have you heard of Jonathan Glover? Here's what he says about killing a newborn. This objection to killing provides no argument against infanticide, for newborn babies have no conception of death and so cannot have any preference for life over death. The objection to infanticide is at most no stronger, listen to this, than the objection of frustrating a baby's current set of desires, say by leaving him to cry unattended for a longish period. Is there something that happens when you get PhD, letter after your name that makes you lose your heart and makes you lose your common sense? Is the have we become so misanthropic in the universities that we can't see that human life is valuable and precious simply because it's human? That's the question we're going to have to ask our friends and neighbors. We are going to have to, and I'm not saying nag them, pound on them, choke them, but we're going to have to confront them with what's at stake here. And let me take a minute how you do that, I think. You do it gently and you do it with love. You don't do it with anger and you don't do it pounding, because people will reject that, just as you would reject it. I call it the stretched rubber band theory. You know when you want to break a rubber band, you stretch it like this. You get a scissors, but let's talk about, no, don't ruin my metaphor. You stretch the rubber band, and you keep stretching it, and eventually it breaks, right? Now, the way I think that all of us change what's happening is like a rubber band. I might go to this woman here and tell her some of the things in a gentle, loving way that's going on. I've stretched the band. Then maybe 3 days later, this lady meets her and she stretches the band. And over a period of months, perhaps even years, eventually someone stretches the band and it breaks. And then this person goes, I should have had a V8. And they come to realize what's happening. And we've made a grand stride toward maintaining sanctity of life as the bottom line ethic of our morality and our public policy. Now, who broke the rubber band? Was it the last person who spoke to this woman? No, it's all of us. Every one of us who stretches that rubber band is part of breaking it. And that's why none of us can take credit when the band breaks, because we're all involved. It's a dynamic, three-dimensional process that we all have to be engaged in at all times when the opportunity arises. And we all have to be activists. If a story comes out, we all have to write letters to the editor, whether they're going to print them or not, because the editors are at least reading the letters. We have to call the talk radio shows. We have to get involved in the chat rooms on the internet. What a tremendous tool. We have to talk to our friends and neighbors. If a friend sees someone in a wheelchair and says, oh, you know, if I were like that, I'd go to Jack Kevorkian, we have to protest and defend the value of that life and say, not one of us is Kevorkian bait. So there's things we can do all the time. You don't have to get up and speak publicly. You don't have to write books, but you do have to engage the culture at every opportunity. Always be looking for the opportunities, because they present themselves all the time. Now let's get into some of the real policies that are hurting real people that I discussed. Let's just start briefly with infanticide. I won't stay here too long because I want to talk about something that I think is terribly urgent for us to deal with, an emergency in this country called feudal care theory. But let's talk just a bit about infanticide. Peter Singer talks about infanticide, and in the Netherlands they actually practice it. I don't want to step on Mark's toes here, but if you take a look at the Lancet, July 26, 1997, they did a survey of doctors who have engaged in euthanasia against disabled infants in the Netherlands. And it turns out, very shocking, 8% of all infants who die in the Netherlands, according to this study, are killed by doctors. That's not 8% of all infants, but 8% of all infants who die in the Netherlands today are killed by doctors. There are about 1,040 infants who die each year, according to this. 8% then is about 80 to 90 infanticides in the Netherlands each year. A country that just formally legalized euthanasia. This was when it was still technically illegal. According to this, 45% of neonatologists who returned survey questionnaires had killed babies. 45% of neonatologists. 31% of pediatricians had killed their patients, killed babies. The first case that went to court that I'm aware of was a case involving spina bifida. Now, you all know what spina bifida is. The baby is born with an opening in the spine. And that leads to sometimes to hydrocephaly, water on the brain. And the child born with spina bifida may grow up to be non-disabled, may grow up to be moderately disabled, may grow up to be profoundly disabled, may end up being incontinent. The proper treatment, of course, is to close the wound on the back and drain the fluids from the brain. So this child was killed at the age of 3 days. And the doctor was asked by the judge, "Why did you do it?" And the judge said, "Well, I had no choice because every time we picked the baby up, it screamed in pain." Why did it scream in pain? They hadn't closed the wound on the back. They hadn't drained the fluid from the brain. Of course it screamed in pain. It was being medically neglected. See the circular thinking that goes on here? And the judge said, "I see. Go out and I wish you good luck in your future career." Infanticide has come to the Netherlands. During World War II, German doctors, and this was not a Nazi issue, it was a physician issue, and I don't have time to go into it because it began way before before Hitler came to power. German doctors killed 250,000 infants and adult disabled people. Some were hanged for it after Nuremberg. During World War II, the German occupier tried to force Dutch doctors to engage in that same kind of medicine, and they refused. They took down their shingles. 100 were sent to concentration camps, from which some did not return. And this civil disobedience worked. They had too many other things on their plate at the time, what with Normandy coming, and so the Dutch doctors were never forced to go into that area that the German doctors did voluntarily. Not all German doctors, obviously, but many. And now the grandchildren of those heroic Dutch physicians think it's right to kill people because they're sick and disabled and to kill infants. Infanticide. Of course, we don't have anything to really complain about, do we? There's something that you all may have worked against called partial birth abortion in this country. Now, the one thing that the pro-life movement has kept saying is that this is an abortion, and the pro-life movement is wrong about that. I did some checking. I looked in a medical book, and much to my surprise, frankly, I found that anything that kills the unborn child from the 20th week or earlier is called an abortion. A miscarriage, a general term, is actually a spontaneous abortion. They're surgical abortions. After the 20th week, it's called a delivery. So what is a partial birth abortion? Now, we all know what that is, but let me just, so we're real clear on the evil here. The woman who wants the late-term abortion, generally after the 20th week, goes to the doctor, and I use the term loosely, who gives her drugs to prematurely induce labor. 3 days later, the cervix has opened to the point where the doctor can reach in, take the baby from head first, flip it around to feet first, pull the child out the birth canal, but before the head pops out, insert something into the skull and take out the brains, and then pull the baby all the way through. Now, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, pro-choice, called that infanticide. And it's true. What it really is a premature induced labor with a killing of the child, a homicide, in the very act of its being born. It's not an abortion. It's an infanticide. And according to people who support this kind of activity, the procedure isn't rare. It occurs between 3,000 and 5,000 times each year in the United States. That's about 10 a day. Most of the fetuses killed are healthy. Most of the mothers are not endangered by their pregnancies. Approximately 80% of partial birth abortions are purely elective. Only a minuscule number of partial birth abortions are undertaken for purely medical reasons. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists could identify no circumstances where a partial birth abortion, quote, would be the only option, close quote, to save or preserve the health of the woman. The American Medical Association found that, quote, there does not appear to be any identical situation in which intact D and X, that's the medical term for it, dilation and extraction, is the only appropriate procedure to induce abortion. So we have infanticide in this country. And guess what the United States Supreme Court did? So what? Did not allow Nebraska and other states to outlaw it. So I'm not sure we have the right to criticize Dutch doctors who lethally inject newborn infants. We have doctors who take out their brains. Ugly stuff. And I understand why people don't want to look it square in the face and want to say that people who try to force them to are fanatics. Who wants to look at that? Who wants to accept that that could happen here? What is of most immediate concern to me is that this idea of quality of life ethic is leading to something called feudal care, I call feudal care theory. In bioethics literature, it's called medical futility. It might be called inappropriate care, and it's coming to a hospital near you. Here's how feudal care theory works. Because remember, it's no longer the sanctity of life, it's the quality of life that counts. If there is a patient who wishes life-sustaining treatment, or the family wants the patient to have life-sustaining treatment, but the physician, and need I say health insurance executive, does not think that the quality of that patient's life is worth living or worth the expense of the treatment, they have the right to say no. One case that I know of that did not work, I lead my book off with, Culture of Death. It's about Christopher Campbell. Christopher Campbell was a young man of 17 in a terrible auto accident. He was in a coma. He started to spike a terrible fever, 105 degrees and rising. John Campbell, his father, it happened over here in Indiana, became desperate. Why isn't my son being treated for his fever? He asked the nurses. The nurses said, the doctor won't give us the authority to go ahead and we can't do it on our own. Christopher's usual doctor was out of town. This was the on-call doctor. John Campbell said, let me speak to that doctor. The doctor avoided the calls, or at least was not available for the calls for a period of time. Finally, the nurses forced the doctor to speak with John. And John demanded treatment. The doctor, according to John Campbell, even laughed, refused to give the treatment to reduce the fever. Finally, John's a very powerful corporate executive. He put every ounce he had into this, and the doctor relented, probably threatened to sue. That's the only tool some people have in these circumstances. And treated the fever, and the fever was reduced. 4.5 months later, against medical expectations, Christopher Campbell woke up. He went through arduous rehabilitation. He is now a disabled man living at home with his folks. He is a counselor to troubled teens. And when Culture of Death came out this last winter, I contacted John Campbell and I said, what's new with Christopher? He had just come back from Africa where he'd gone on a missionary journey and had been so beloved by the people he was helping that they wrote music about him which had been put onto a CD. And with his father, he had started a foundation that feeds 40 African children breakfast every morning, 365 days a year. If the doctor had been able to say his life isn't worth living, I'm not going to provide the treatment, none of that would have happened. Christopher would be a cherished memory instead of a living son. But you see, that hospital, this happened 5-6 years ago, did not have a fetal care protocol. And what's happening now in hospitals across this country are these fetal care protocols are being put in place. And one of the reasons they're being put in place, if you look at the literature, is so that when John Campbell says, treat my son or I will sue you, they're going to say, Mr. Campbell, make our day. Meet us in court, because we have a protocol and a process we will go through that we expect a judge to honor, because the judge will say, who am I, a mere lawyer, to gainsay what doctors have said is the right thing. And here's how the protocol works, and if you want to see one, go to Health Progress, July, August 2000. You know what's really frightening is Health Progress is the journal of the Catholic Hospital Association. The name of the article is Time for a Formalized Medical Futility Policy. There is a policy at the end of that article that is printed that has been put in place in the Mercy Health Systems of Philadelphia. And here's how it works. John Campbell wants treatment for his son or somebody like John Campbell. The doctor doesn't want to provide it. John Campbell insists. The doctor says, well, let's go talk to the ethics committee, the hospital ethics committee, which are important bodies. I mean, they're supposed to be mediating bodies that help people work through difficult issues. But they're being turned into adjudicatory bodies, which they were never intended to do, with the right to turn thumbs up or thumbs down to life-sustaining treatment. And usually, in most policies, it's the ethics committee that then decides whether the care is provided or not. And if the ethics committee says no to the treatment, then even if the patient gets another doctor willing to provide the care, that hospital can say, no, we're not going to allow that to occur. And one of the things we're all going to need to start thinking about doing is getting doctors on panels and lawyers on panels to take these cases before it gets to these ethics committees, willing to take over care on a pro bono, or I prefer a sliding scale basis, because everyone has to have a stake in things, to prevent this kind of thing from occurring. Now, in this particular circumstance, if the ethics committee can't work it out, there's a different committee. It's called the Institutional Ethics Committee, the Institutional Interdisciplinary Review Board, IIRB, and then it says, for adjudication. Since when does wash out my mouth with soap. Since when does a review board have the right to adjudicate anything? That's the job of courts. It's not the job of informal review boards who act and meet in secret, which is what happens. This is a Catholic journal talking about a Catholic hospital system that has put in that kind of circumstance. And if you don't think it's happening, go to the Journal of the American Medical Association. You will see that similar protocols have been put in place in Houston. Go read the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, Volume 9, Number 4, Fall 2000. And this is really relevant to me from California. They reviewed 26 hospital fetal care protocols, and 24 of these hospitals, out of 26 hospitals, had these fetal care protocols in place. And here's what they say about that. Hospitals are likely to find the legal system willing and even eager to defer to well-defined and procedurally scrupulous processes for internal resolutions of futility disputes. In other words, they expect the courts to wash their hands of this issue. And you know what? That's a pretty good bet. It's a pretty good bet. That's what these fetal care protocols are about. We don't know how many are installed. We don't know where. You might want to contact your local hospital and see if they have one. But it's even worse than that. I mean, these are designed to make it so that if John Campbell or somebody like that sued, that the courts were more likely to rule on behalf of the hospital. But now they're beginning to put these kinds of language into statutes to legalize formally feudal care theory. Senator Arlen Specter has a new bill, 171-page bill, S-24. You can find it on the internet. And in Title VI, subsection B, subsection 2, he says you can refuse or accept treatment, which of course we all accept. But then he says treatment which is not medically indicated. Nothing in this subsection shall be construed to require that any individual be offered or to state that any individual may demand medical treatment which the healthcare provider does not have available or which is, and listen to this, under prevailing medical standards, either futile or otherwise not medically indicated. Now, if John Campbell had gone to the doctor saying, treat Christopher, and the doctor had said, well, under prevailing medical standards, Mr. Campbell, reducing Christopher's fever is not medically indicated, John Campbell would have been out of luck. And worse, so would Christopher. S-24, if it gets into federal law, it's national. In New York, AB 5523 tries to do the same thing. And I won't go into the details, but it says that if the hospital ethics committee says that it's not appropriate, inappropriate, or it's futile, then the hospital can sue the patient or the family to be allowed to not provide the treatment. But look what it says about the ethics review committee confidentiality. We're talking about creating secret star chambers. Quote, notwithstanding any other provision of law, the proceedings and records of an ethics review committee shall be kept confidential and shall not be released by committee members, committee consultants, or other persons privy to such proceedings and records. The proceedings and records of an ethics review committee shall not be subject to disclosure or inspection in any manner, including under Article 6 of the Public Officers Law, blah, blah, blah. And no person shall testify as to the proceedings or records of an ethics review committee, nor shall any proceedings and records otherwise be admissible as evidence in any action or proceeding of any kind in any court or before any other tribunal, board, agency, or person. Utter secrecy. Why? Killing is best done in the dark, isn't it? You don't like to kill in the light of day. Doesn't that get back to we let people die or we can kill them, the idea of personhood? Because who we're talking about here are the frail elderly. Who we're talking about here are people like Robert Wendland with significant cognitive incapacities. California, again, I didn't see this one coming because I was fighting an assisted suicide law, and while I was fighting an assisted suicide law, a little law was put into place called Probate Code 4735. A healthcare provider or healthcare institution may decline to comply with an individual healthcare instruction or healthcare decision that requires medically ineffective healthcare. That's physiological futility. I support that. That is, for example, if you have an ulcer and you demand chemotherapy, no doctor should provide it because that is futile. That's physiologically futile. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a value system, not physiological. Ineffective healthcare or healthcare contrary to the generally accepted healthcare standards applicable to the healthcare provider or institution. That's futile care. They say what can be done or not done in their institution, and then this code section says they have the power to do that and they can refuse treatment if they've said so. That's like Napoleon crowning himself emperor, isn't it? That's now California law. This, of course, is leading to healthcare rationing, which is its point. And you start with the most vulnerable and the seemingly, well, who would want to have a person hooked up to a respirator for 3 weeks? They might as well die. Why just extend the dying? Well, whose 3 weeks is it? I had a medical student. Actually, I was in front of a Christian medical student group, and I was talking about this, and a very bright, sharp young woman came up to me, and she said, you know, I've seen people in the intensive care unit with a respirator, and that's so undignified. Why should I have to provide that? And I said, excuse me, miss, but who died and made you queen? And she got big eyes and she said, I bought into bioethics. I said, yeah. Don't beat up on yourself. It's easy to do. We all do in some regard. But it's really important for you to realize that that person who wants that 3 weeks on the respirator has equal moral worth with the person who's young and vigorous and just broke their leg while rock climbing. And if we stop thinking that, then there's no such thing as universal human rights, is there? And of course it gets down to, and I will quit sort of on time, is there a duty to die? This is a cover story in the Hastings Center report. Is there a duty to die? Guess what the answer is? A duty to die is more likely when continuing to live will impose significant burdens. Since when is caring for each other a burden? Why isn't that the most human thing we do, is care for each other? We don't leave our people by the side of the road. We're not like a herd of zebra when a lion takes down a zebra, we just keep on galloping. At least we never used to be. Emotional burdens, extensive caregiving, destruction of life plans, and yes, financial hardship on your family and loved ones. This is the fundamental insight underlying a duty to die. A duty to die becomes greater as you grow older. Listen to this. To have reached the age of, say, 75 or 80 years without being ready to die is itself a moral failing, the sign of a life out of touch with life's basic realities. And it goes on and on. There are now books, in fact, I saw one this morning, all about the duty to die. And that's where feudal care leads us to. Feudal care is about certain people. Look, time to go. You're in our face. We don't like looking at you because you remind us of our own mortality, and we don't want to spend the money on you. And that leads to health care rationing, which is just a polite term for medical discrimination against the most expensive. And that leads to a duty to die because nobody should burden people. And that's what's behind the assisted suicide movement. Why are people killing themselves in Oregon? Because they don't want to be a burden on their families. It's not because they're in pain that can't be treated. The pain issue is the foot in the door. The reality is, we are saying, whether it's through feudal care or through assisted suicide, as I promise I will let Mark talk about, that some people just have no duty, no right to be here. I read something a few years ago that I'd like to share with you because I think it's quite appropriate. And let me read it to you. I am aware that many may object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. When William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, penned those words on January 1st, 1831, there was no abolitionist movement. 35 years later, there was no slavery. His task was to try to eradicate one of the worst evils in the history of humankind. Our task is to prevent such evil from actually getting embedded into the culture. And if we all have more energy than the people who want that, we will prevail. It's a job of a lifetime, and it's the most important work I can imagine for anyone to do in the brief period of time that we are privileged to have here on this planet. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for all the good you do.